Georgina Spelvin's life story is a tapestry that mingles determination, art, scandal, and obscurity into a single, surprising narrative. She emerged during the so-called Golden Age of Porn, an era in the early to mid-1970s when adult films enjoyed a momentary acceptance, or at least curiosity, from the mainstream, breaching cultural norms in a way both provocative and undeniably historic. To watch her on screen in The Devil and Miss Jones is to behold someone balancing two contrary impulses, the desire to craft a serious performance and the awareness that she was stepping into highly controversial territory. Yet for all the talk about what she did, who she was on set, and how she scandalized certain corners of America, there remains a silence about what happened to her in the years since. Did she pass away in unpublicized quiet, or is she still alive, living in well-earned retirement? That uncertainty underscores the complex legacy of a woman whose name was once synonymous with transgression, yet who might have managed to slip away from the public eye entirely. Georgina Spelvin was born as Shelley Graham on March 1, 1936 in Houston, Texas. Little in her early life suggested that she would one day become a linchpin in the adult film world, so much so that her stage name, Georgina Spelvin, would one day resonate with fans of 1970s erotic cinema. In those younger years, she was a fairly typical teenager in the mid-century American sense, reared in an era of Elvis, drive-in theaters, and post-war optimism. She dabbled in dance, acting, and various odd jobs, nothing that pointed definitively toward the adult entertainment industry. But what she did have was an interest in theater and a sense of daring that would, a couple of decades later, propel her into the cultural flashpoint of pornographic film. Life has a way of throwing unexpected pathways at us, and Spelvin's first brush with show business wasn't behind an X-rated camera. She moved to New York City as a young woman, joining the swirl of aspiring performers who arrived in droves. She found the occasional gig working in off-Broadway productions, stage crews, and even as a dancer. Part of that bohemian existence included mingling in art circles that embraced free expression, championed the avant-garde, and questioned social boundaries at every turn. Still, those were small stepping stones that wouldn't define her place in history, yet. By the time the late 1960s and early 1970s rolled around, the sexual revolution was in full force. Hollywood might have been slow to catch up, but small independent filmmakers were thriving in a new atmosphere that was less repressed and more openly curious about desire, erotica, and taboo. Adult film was stepping out from the raincoat crowd stigma and inching toward a kind of cultural conversation. Deep Throat, 1972, starring Linda Lovelace, had already generated enormous buzz, leaving critics, audiences, and lawmakers stunned. It was labeled porno chic, a term that suggested these films were flirting with mainstream interest and not simply banished to seedy theaters. It was around this time that Georgina Spelvin found herself auditioning for roles that straddled that tenuous line between legitimate theater and the emerging porn genre. She possessed a clear, intelligent gaze and a willingness to fully inhabit whichever character she was given. More importantly, she approached even the most explicitly sexual material with a sense of craft. That attitude would soon set her apart from many of her peers, some of whom were purely in it for the money or the thrill. For Spelvin, it was, at least in part, a form of performance art. The moment that would transform her life came in 1973, when she was cast in Gerard Damiano's The Devil and Miss Jones. Damiano, fresh off the success of Deep Throat, was seeking to push adult film further. He wanted to craft an erotic piece that also had an element of psychological depth, something that would both titillate and disturb. In this sense, The Devil in Miss Jones was a narrative about a woman named Justine Jones who ends her own life and, upon reaching the afterlife, is offered a startling proposition: return to earth for one last experience of the flesh, though the price will be condemnation to eternal hell afterward. The role demanded not just willingness to perform explicit acts on camera, but also genuine acting chops, portraying despair, existential crisis, and the agony of longing. Georgina Spelvin dove into the part like it was a legitimate stage role in a classic drama. In fact, she once compared playing Justine Jones to performing Hedda Gabler, an iconic Ibsen character. The comparison was no casual boast. She intended to inhabit this character wholeheartedly, exploring her internal torment and sexual reawakening. For mainstream America, however, any serious artistic intention was overshadowed by the film's explicit content. The Devil in Miss Jones quickly became both a commercial juggernaut and a cultural lightning rod. Audiences who ventured into adult theaters to see it were shocked by its frank depictions of sexuality, oral sex, group encounters, and more, all captured in a style that was more narrative-driven than the loops or rudimentary stag films of prior decades. Critics debated whether to treat it as an experimental piece of cinema or dismiss it as smut. Religious and conservative groups howled in protest, demanding crackdowns and labeling the film a gross moral affront. Censorship boards across the country scrambled to figure out how to classify and control it. Meanwhile, Georgina Spelvin found herself propelled from relative anonymity into a scandal-laced spotlight. She was, for better or worse, the devil in Miss Jones, the face of a film that was testing the boundaries of free speech and sexual expression. The scandal was twofold. First, there was the usual condemnation that surrounded most pornographic films, but especially those with enough story or budget to catch the eye of more conventional media. Second, Spelvin's intense and believable performance invited a different kind of scrutiny. She wasn't some disposable figure in a low-rent flick. She was a performer who took her role seriously, which led some viewers to question how she could so earnestly participate in hardcore content. In interviews, she explained that she viewed acting as acting, regardless of whether it was in a mainstream production or an X-rated one. Her desire to invest in the role psychologically didn't make her any less aware of the sexual nature of the scenes. That discrepancy between her artistic intent and the public's perception of pornography formed a deep chasm she would never quite bridge. In the eyes of moral critics, it didn't matter how serious she was still partaking in something they deemed indecent. If The Devil in Miss Jones made her famous or infamous, the reverberations of its success shaped her next few years. In 1974, Spelvin found herself embroiled in legal trouble that underscored America's conflicted stance on adult content. She was living in Maine at the time, presumably eager to escape some of the big city glare. However, the film's distribution chain wound its way into Tennessee, and local authorities there considered it obscene. She was subsequently charged with transporting obscene materials across state lines. The case was a stark reminder that different parts of the U.S. had radically different definitions of decency, and adult films were not by any stretch uniformly accepted. Even though Spelvin was not personally ferrying the reels in her trunk, distributors handled that. Her mere involvement as the film's star and perceived face of the production made her a target. The scandal was as much about censorship as it was about pornography. Spelvin's predicament became something of a rallying point for free expression advocates who argued that the government's attempts to prosecute her were nothing but moral paternalism. The case dragged on, overshadowing her efforts to lead a semi-normal life. Although the charges were ultimately dropped by 1977, those years in legal limbo didn't come without stress. Court dates, legal fees, public condemnation, and ongoing press coverage all contributed to the sense that she was more of a symbol than a real person with hopes and anxieties. In one sense, it made her even more notorious, a name frequently bandied about in debates on what constituted obscenity versus protected free speech. In another sense, it chipped away at her personal equilibrium, making it increasingly difficult to envision a future beyond these controversies. Behind the scenes, Georgina Spelvin was experiencing a private yearning for something different. Her brush with adult film fame had been exhilarating, but she wasn't content to remain pigeonholed as a porn star forever. She harbored ambitions of transitioning into mainstream acting, perhaps smaller roles in legitimate theater, a television appearance, or an indie film that didn't revolve around explicit sex. Given that Linda Lovelace had briefly flirted with mainstream curiosity post-Deep Throat, Spelvin might have hoped to find a similar path. However, the adult industry in the 1970s was like a vortex. Once you became a recognized star, it was exceedingly difficult to break free from both the public stigma and the behind-the-scenes politics. Spelvin's personal struggles became entangled with these professional hurdles. She wrestled with alcoholism, a disease that often lurks in the corners of the entertainment world, and this period was marked by attempts to recalibrate her life. Friends from the adult industry and from the mainstream either supported her or were themselves grappling with the same issues. The combination of addiction, legal battles, and typecasting was a heavy load. It didn't help that the adult film world in that era wasn't exactly brimming with mental health resources or empathetic guidance for those who might have needed it, especially for women performers who were often seen as either money-making commodities or moral pariahs. It was easy to feel isolated. Her efforts to shift into a new chapter inevitably caused friction with the collaborators and managers who had helped build her adult film persona. Some felt betrayed by her desire to leave that world behind or minimize it. Rumors circulated that she was too good for the people who had first cast her, while others quietly acknowledged she was trying to escape a life that no longer fulfilled her. This tension never quite boiled over into a massive public scandal, but it was a significant undercurrent for Georgina Spelvin's journey in the late 1970s. She had soared to the heights of notoriety, and now she was navigating the crash back down to earth. No easy feat for any performer, let alone one whose craft had been so sensationalized. By 1982, Spelvin had effectively stepped away from filming adult movies. The reasons were multifaceted: burnout from the demands of the industry, disillusionment with the repeated typecasting, and a deeper desire for a life that might be calmer and more private. In her memoir, The Devil Made Me Do It, a cheeky reference to her iconic role, she candidly discusses this time, painting a picture of someone who was both proud of her accomplishments and haunted by the social stigmas that attach themselves to her name. She wrote about her struggles with alcohol, the complexities of romance when your public persona is entwined with sexual explicitness, and the challenge of finding a new community once you've distanced yourself from your original claim to fame. After her retirement from adult entertainment, Georgina Spelvin embarked on a path that many stars of her era found, merging into the broader workforce in ways that had little or nothing to do with porn. She did some graphic arts work in Hollywood, using her creative streak in a less sensational setting. She occasionally popped up in cameo roles or was interviewed in retrospective documentaries about the golden age of porn, but she never returned to the spotlight in a major way. For a time, she seemed content to fade from the limelight, forging a life more defined by her personal relationships and everyday routines than by the shock or allure of explicit cinema. One bright development in her post-adult film life was her relationship with actor John Welsh, whom she married in 2000. The marriage was a sign, perhaps, that she was finding some degree of stability and happiness after years of public controversy. By all accounts, she maintained warm friendships with those who remained close to her, but she also cultivated a quieter existence. The mid-2000s saw a resurgence of interest in the Golden Age, spurred by nostalgic documentaries like Inside Deep Throat and the emergence of After Porn Ends style docuseries, which examined what happened to adult performers once the cameras stopped rolling. Georgina Spelvin appeared in After Porn Ends 2, 2017, which offered viewers a glimpse into her reflections on that complicated past. She spoke with a mixture of frankness and humor, underscoring that she had no deep regrets, but also no illusions about how the industry might have used her or how the public perceived her. And then slowly the updates ceased. As of 2025, any definitive information about Georgina Spelvin's status is conspicuously absent from mainstream media. No obituary has been published in a major newspaper. There hasn't been an official announcement from family or friends, nor has any press release circulated from the adult entertainment community, which often commemorates the passing of its notable figures. Fans searching for confirmation of her whereabouts or her health hit a wall of speculation. Some claim to have seen her in the neighborhood near Hollywood, leading an unremarkable, quiet life. Others swear they've read rumors that she passed away, but was never memorialized publicly. This uncertainty stands in stark contrast to the sensational spotlight that once followed her every move, particularly in the mid-1970s, when The Devil in Miss Jones was the talk of moral watchdogs and curious cinephiles alike. One might assume that if she had indeed died, the adult film press or tabloids would have seized on the story, paying tribute or dredging up controversies from decades prior. Yet so far, silence. It's as though Georgina Spelvin managed to do what so few luminaries of that era could: slip out of the public gaze without fueling a swirl of scandal or speculation. In some corners of the internet, fans discuss the possibility that she's still alive, noting that she would be in her late 80s or early 90s, a plausible age to be living privately away from the cameras. They point out how other Golden Age figures have sometimes receded into near anonymity, surfacing only when recognized by a particularly ardent fan or discovered by someone researching the history of pornography. Others speculate that a quiet death might have already come and gone, reported only to close friends or family, with no inclination to make a spectacle of it. For a performer whose name once provoked a swirl of sensational headlines, the idea of a discreet exit might actually be consistent with her more introspective later years. This lack of a publicly documented death invites reflection on how the media and the public treat adult film stars. During the Golden Age, these performers were catapulted into notoriety, both revered and reviled, depending on who was doing the talking. That intense fame often gave way to harsh neglect once the mainstream moved on, leaving them without the usual safety net of tributes and legacy building that might accompany an aging Hollywood star. Georgina Spelvin's story is emblematic of that phenomenon. She was once a mainstay in arguments about censorship, morality, and artistic freedom. Decades later, she might have left this world without so much as a passing notice in the press. This final mystery, Spelvin's actual whereabouts or ultimate fate, carries a poetic quality. For a performer who played a woman confronting the afterlife so intimately, the enigma of her own life's end resonates at a deep level. The Devil in Miss Jones was about a character grappling with existential questions, longing for more experience, and ultimately facing damnation. Spelvin's own life, in a more mundane but still poignant sense, involves stepping into taboo territory, living through public condemnations, and seeking some kind of personal redemption or peace. Whether she's still alive in a quiet corner of Los Angeles, or whether she departed this plane with no headlines to mark her passing, her journey stands as a testament to the complicated legacy of adult film's golden age. It's worth noting the significant differences between Georgina Spelvin's uncertain final chapter and the deaths of contemporaries like Marilyn Chambers, who passed away in 2009 under circumstances that prompted coroner's investigations and considerable media coverage. Chambers had become a cultural figure from a moment, Ivory Snow, that collided with hardcore porn in a scandal that newspapers devoured. Her death, therefore, felt like the final punctuation mark on a storied, tumultuous life. In Spelvin's case, the storyline lingers in ellipses. Perhaps she's still around, or perhaps she left quietly a while back. That inconclusiveness might frustrate researchers or fans who want closure, but it also aligns with the complicated tapestry of her life, which never fit neatly into moral or narrative boxes. Looking back on Spelvin's path, one sees more than just a porn star or a figure in an obscene materials case. She was a courageous performer in a time of explosive social change, and she tackled roles that demanded emotional vulnerability at a level beyond what most mainstream actors ever faced. She navigated personal demons like alcoholism that threatened her well-being. She endured legal battles, public shaming, and the weight of a name that became symbolic of sexual taboo, and yet she also found love, created art in quieter forms, and managed to step away from the camera with her wits intact. That's not a trivial achievement, considering how many adult film personalities of that era found themselves undone by the pressure, exploitation, and lack of support. In interviews, Spelvin's intelligence and wit always stood out. She understood that for many viewers, pornography was simply fodder for momentary gratification. But for her, it was also an acting challenge. She dissected the scripts, pointed out narrative arcs, and treated the emotional beats with respect. Her approach raised the bar for what a performer in adult film could do, lending credibility to the idea that, in the right hands, erotic cinema might just be another branch of storytelling. Of course, audiences and critics were not always ready to accept that notion, but the presence of a performer like Spelvin, who refused to dismiss her work as mere sleaze, left a lasting impression. If one bothers to read serious writings about the golden age of porn, Georgina Spelvin's name invariably pops up as an example of how certain adult films in that era flirted with genuine cinematic ambition. From that vantage point, the swirl of controversies that dogged her, whether in the form of outraged critics, obscenity charges, or industry friction, can be seen as the price she paid for stepping into a space that was radical for its time. Being a porn star in the 1970s was not simply a matter of making money or chasing notoriety. It was an inherently political act. The culture wars were raging, and each adult film release carried the potential to spark moral panic or legislative crackdowns. Spelvin found herself caught in the crossfire, sometimes embracing her status as a boundary pusher, at other times longing to sidestep the limelight entirely. Her ultimate retreat from the industry and her pivot to graphic arts might look, in hindsight, like a resolution of that tension. She had done what she set out to do, achieved fame, tested the boundaries of performance, earned a place in the annals of adult film history, and could now slip into a life less fraught with conflict. Granted, her name still conjured up strong reactions, but the onslaught of new faces and the gradual shift in how porn was produced with the advent of videotapes and then the internet meant that Spelvin's brand of stardom was never replicated. She belonged to a singular moment, a phenomenon not likely to repeat itself, and so her story ends or continues in mystery. As the calendar marches forward, those who seek to confirm whether Georgina Spelvin is still alive find nothing conclusive. Some might imagine her, now in her late 80s, taking morning walks and sipping tea, recounting her extraordinary past to a select few confidants. Others suspect she might have passed some time ago, her departure shielded by the privacy she spent years crafting. In a world obsessed with social media and instantaneous updates, the notion of a once famous individual managing to disappear so thoroughly is both confounding and oddly admirable. It's as though she took the final bow she always wanted, one that didn't involve a hail of paparazzi flashes or sensational headlines. In reflecting on Georgina Spelvin's life, one is reminded of how swiftly public opinion can change and how ephemeral the scandals of one era can appear in hindsight. What was once labeled obscene enough to warrant criminal charges in Tennessee might now appear almost quaint in comparison to the adult content readily available online. The moral outrage that made national headlines in the 1970s has transmuted into a cultural shrug in many circles. But for Spelvin, that outrage was real and personal. She bore the brunt of it, standing in courtrooms, facing condemnation from strangers, and having her aspirations overshadowed by the stigma of pornography. Despite it all, her contributions to film, however niche or controversial, shouldn't be minimized. The Devil in Miss Jones remains a landmark in the adult genre, studied by those who examine the brief era when porn tried to be cinematic in a more narrative sense. It's recognized for Gerard Damiano's direction, but it's also revered for the lead performance, a portrayal that was unusually nuanced for an adult film at the time. Spelvin's willingness to bare her soul and her body on camera paved the way for subsequent discussions about whether adult performers can be considered legitimate actors. The film's success also, ironically, set the stage for the wave of legal entanglements that would follow, highlighting the tension between artistic freedom and community standards. In the end, Georgina Spelvin's story captures the complexities of that golden age of porn. It was an era of rebellious creativity, cultural upheaval, and fervent moral debate. Spelvin stood at the intersection of those forces, celebrated for her distinctive acting, demonized for her explicit roles, and investigated for alleged obscenity. Then quietly, she stepped away. If there's any truth to the rumors that she outlived many of her contemporaries and found contentment away from the spotlight, one could argue that she's one of the luckier ones. Many icons of that period met tragic fates consumed by addiction, violence, or diseases that ravaged the community. Spelvin, by contrast, might have had the final word, slipping into a subdued existence that protected her from further scandal and allowing her at long last the personal peace she had sought. Yet the question remains, did she truly pass on with no obituary to mark her departure, or is she possibly reading these words somewhere, bemused by the speculation surrounding her? The enigma lingers. inviting fans, historians, and casual observers alike to reflect on how ephemeral fame can be. One moment, your name is embroiled in national debates over morality. The next, you could vanish so thoroughly that even your death passes unreported. Perhaps that final twist is the ultimate commentary on our culture's relationship with sex, scandal, and celebrity. Once you're no longer fueling the headlines, once you're no longer the defiant star of an X-rated phenomenon, the world moves on. And so Georgina Spelvin remains a figure suspended between memory and myth, part of the ephemeral tapestry of that era's shock, fascination, and changing mores. She gave an electrifying performance in The Devil and Miss Jones, challenged obscenity laws in places like Tennessee, navigated personal struggles that remained mostly behind the scenes, and then, in one of the quietest exits imaginable, receded from view. That her final chapter is so uncertain seems strangely fitting for someone who ventured so boldly into territory that defied categorization. If she is still with us, living in the gentle rhythms of old age, one can only imagine the kaleidoscope of memories she carries from a life that spanned from off-Broadway grit to adult film infamy. If she has passed on, then perhaps we can only say that Georgina Spelvin took her final bow in a style that, for once, outsmarted the media machine that once clamored for every salacious detail. Either way, her name endures in the annals of adult entertainment history, a testament to how one role, one performance, and one risk can provoke a lasting conversation on the nature of art, scandal, and human desire.